1 copper, Clara Whitmore's stepfather said, loud enough for the whole market to hear. That's all the worthless Omega is worth. Rain tapped against the wooden auction platform like cold fingers, steady and merciless, turning the dirt below into dark mud that swallowed boots whole. Clara lowered her gaze to the soaked boards beneath her feet, watching tiny rivers of water snake around the frayed hem of her pale gray dress. The fabric clung to her arms, thin enough now that the autumn wind slipped through it without resistance. Somewhere behind the crowd, thunder rolled low across the valley. No one moved to cover her from the rain. No one ever did. The trading square of Black Hollow smelled like wet horses, damp hay, and smoke from roasting meat drifting from vendor stalls that stood far enough away to pretend none of this belonged to them. But everyone came to watch the Omega auctions. Misfortune had always been entertainment in packs like these, especially when it belonged to someone weak. Clara folded her trembling hands in front of her, hiding them beneath her sleeves before anyone could notice. She had learned years ago that fear became sport the moment people saw it. Can she even shift? Someone called from the crowd, followed by scattered laughter. Barely, her stepfather answered before she could speak. Gregory Whitmore stood at the edge of the platform beneath an umbrella held by Clara's older stepsister, Evelyn, who somehow managed to stay perfectly dry despite the weather. She's 22 and weak as a rabbit. Useless around a proper pack. Doesn't hunt. Doesn't fight. Never bonded properly. Evelyn tilted her chin, lips curling with practiced cruelty. But she cleans, she added brightly. And she doesn't complain much. More laughter drifted through the square. Clara kept her eyes lowered. She had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. Kindness had left with her mother 6 winters ago, buried beneath cold dirt on a hill overlooking the Whitmore land. After that, the house had become quieter somehow, though never peaceful. Quieter in the way storms paused before becoming worse. Gregory called Clara a burden. Evelyn called her embarrassing. And somehow every month there was always another reason why keeping her alive cost too much. The medicine for Gregory's bad knee. Repairs for the barn roof. Evelyn's gowns for festival season. There was always something more important than Clara. Last week, she had overheard the conversation through the kitchen wall. Sell her, Evelyn had said between bites of supper. No one wants her, but someone will buy cheap labor. Gregory had laughed then. Maybe if we're lucky, someone desperate enough will overpay. Clara had stood in the dark pantry afterward, clutching a loaf of stale bread to her chest, trying to convince herself they didn't mean it. Families didn't sell daughters. Even unwanted ones. Apparently she had been wrong. 1 copper, Gregory repeated now, impatient. Anybody. A few men near the front smirked but didn't raise their hands. One of them shook his head. Wouldn't survive winter, he muttered. Looks too soft. Probably cries, another said. Evelyn laughed under her breath. Oh, she does. Clara swallowed hard and looked away. Beyond the crowd, near the edge of the square, she spotted a boy no older than 10 huddled beneath a torn blanket beside an empty crate. Thin shoulders. Bare hands red from cold. No coat. He looked hungry. Her chest tightened instinctively. She knew that look. The kind where hunger stopped feeling sharp and simply settled inside you like exhaustion. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her dress. Her fingers brushed the small piece of bread she had hidden before dawn. It wasn't much. Barely half a roll saved from yesterday's kitchen scraps. Probably the only thing she'd eat all day. Gregory was still talking above her. Worthless Omega. Cheap price. The words blurred into the rain. Before she could think too hard about it, Clara stepped carefully down from the platform. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Gregory frowned. Where do you think you're going? She didn't answer. The mud soaked through her worn shoes as she crossed toward the boy. He looked startled when she crouched in front of him. Up close, she could see the way he shivered despite trying hard not to. Here, Clara said quietly, holding out the bread. You should eat something warm if you can find it. The boy stared like he thought it might disappear if he reached too quickly. But don't you need it? He asked softly. Clara smiled, though it felt fragile around the edges. I'll be okay. He accepted it carefully, hands shaking. Behind her, someone laughed. Look at that, a voice sneered. She can't even save herself and she's still playing hero. More laughter followed. Clara stood slowly, brushing rainwater from her sleeves. She should have felt embarrassed, maybe humiliated. Instead, something strange settled quietly in her chest. Calm. The kind that came whenever she helped someone else hurt a little less, even if only for a moment. Then the market suddenly fell silent. Not gradually. Instantly. Like the entire square had forgotten how to breathe. Clara frowned and turned. At the far end of the muddy road, black horses had stopped just beyond the gates. Tall. Powerful. Their dark coats gleamed beneath the rain. Men in royal armor climbed down first, silver wolf crests shining against obsidian leather. No one spoke. No one moved. Somewhere near the front, someone whispered barely audible, "The king." Clara's breath caught without understanding why. And then she saw him step from the carriage, impossibly still despite the storm, dressed in black so dark it seemed to swallow the gray afternoon whole. The rain softened into a cold mist that clung to Clara Whitmore's skin as if the storm itself had decided to linger. Around her, the market square stood frozen in a silence so complete that even the restless horses seemed unwilling to make a sound. Clara had never seen fear move through people so quickly. Heads lowered. Conversations vanished. Even Gregory Whitmore, a man who always seemed to have cruel words ready at the edge of his tongue, suddenly straightened his coat and looked smaller somehow. King Damon Blackthorne walked through the muddy square without hurry, though every step carried the kind of quiet authority that made people move out of the way before they even realized they were doing it. Tall enough to make most men seem diminished beside him, he wore a long black coat darkened by rain, the sharp lines of it moving around him like shadows. His dark hair brushed the collar of his coat, damp from the weather, while silver eyes scanned the square with unsettling calm. He did not look angry. Somehow that felt worse. Clara had heard stories about him before. Everyone had. The ruthless Alpha King of the Northern Territories. A ruler who ended disputes with cold efficiency and expected loyalty without question. Some said he had rebuilt broken pacts with fairness. Others whispered that crossing him meant losing everything you valued. Clara had never imagined she would stand close enough to see him in person. She wished suddenly that her dress was not soaked through and patched at the sleeves. One of the royal guard stepped forward first, his voice carrying across the square. "All trading is suspended until further notice." A murmur moved through the crowd. Gregory's expression tightened instantly. "Your Majesty," he said quickly, stepping forward with forced politeness, "we were only conducting legal pact business." Damon's gaze shifted toward him without expression. "Legal," he repeated quietly. The single word settled strangely in the air. Gregory swallowed hard. Beside him, Evelyn adjusted the hood of her cloak and lowered her eyes, though Clara noticed the way her posture subtly straightened. Evelyn always adjusted herself around power. Clara remained near the edge of the platform, uncertain whether she should stay invisible or disappear entirely. Her fingers curled around the damp fabric of her sleeves. Somewhere nearby, the hungry boy she had given bread to was still sitting beneath the crate, staring wide-eyed at the king like everyone else. Damon's attention moved across the market slowly. The auction cages. The frightened Omegas waiting beneath covered awnings. The guards avoiding eye contact. Then his gaze stopped. Clara felt it before she fully understood it. Heavy. Direct. Unavoidable. She looked up before she could stop herself. For one impossible second the entire square disappeared. The noise. The rain. The cold. All of it faded beneath the weight of silver eyes fixed entirely on her. Not Gregory. Not Evelyn. Her. Clara's breath caught painfully in her chest. Instinct told her to look away immediately, but something in his expression stopped her. There was no cruelty there. No mockery. No amusement. Only something unreadable. Calculating perhaps. Curious. Then movement broke the moment. A sharp cough echoed from near the vendor stalls. Clara turned instinctively. The same young boy from earlier had doubled over beneath his blanket, shoulders trembling from cold. Without thinking, Clara stepped away from the platform again. "Clara," Gregory hissed sharply under his breath, "get back here." She ignored him. The boy looked pale now, smaller somehow. Carefully, Clara crouched beside him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded too quickly, clearly lying. His hand shook against the piece of bread she had given him. Clara hesitated only a moment before removing the thin shawl from around her shoulders and wrapping it carefully around him. The cold bit instantly through the damp fabric of her dress, but she barely noticed. "You need this more than I do," she whispered. "Stay warm." "You fool," Gregory muttered loudly behind her. "She gives away the only thing she owns." A few nervous laughs followed from the crowd, quieter this time, less confident. Clara ignored them. The boy's eyes widened. "Why are you helping me?" he asked quietly. Clara smiled faintly, though exhaustion tugged at the corners of it. "Because somebody should." Silence followed her answer. A strange silence. The kind that made the back of her neck prickle. Slowly she stood. Only then did she realize the market had gone still again. Not because of fear this time. Because King Damon Blackthorn had stopped walking entirely. He stood only a few feet away now, rain catching against the dark fabric of his coat, silver eyes lowered toward the boy wrapped in Clara's shawl. Then his gaze lifted to her. Somewhere behind her someone whispered nervously, "Why is he looking at her?" Damon said nothing at first. He simply watched Clara for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then finally his deep voice broke the silence. "What is your name?" Before we continue, if stories of courage, fate, and impossible beginnings speak to you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so you do not miss the next chapter of Clara's story or other unforgettable tales waiting ahead. Clara swallowed hard, rain slipping down her temple as every eye in Black Hollow turned toward her at once. "Clara," she said softly. "My name is Clara Whitmore." Clara could feel every pair of eyes in Black Hollow pressing against her the moment her name left her lips. The rain had thinned to a cold mist, but the chill settling into her bones had little to do with weather now. Gregory Whitmore shifted uneasily several feet away, suddenly far less confident than he had been only minutes earlier. Evelyn's painted smile had disappeared completely, replaced with something sharper. Calculation. Fear. Confusion. Clara stood frozen where she was, damp curls sticking against her cheeks, hands trembling faintly beneath the sleeves of her faded dress. She did not understand why the king was speaking to her. People like King Damon Blackthorn did not notice women like Clara. Certainly not Omega girls standing barefoot in mud beside an auction block. Damon's silver eyes remained fixed on her for another long second, unreadable and still. Close enough now, Clara noticed details she had missed from afar. The faint streak of rain running down the sharp line of his jaw. The dark leather gloves folded loosely in one hand. The quiet steadiness in the way he stood, as if storms simply moved around him instead of touching him. He looked less like the frightening stories people whispered about, and more like something carved from winter itself. Cold. Controlled. Impossible to move. "Clara Whitmore," Damon repeated quietly, as though testing the name against memory. Something flickered briefly across his expression before disappearing. "You gave away your food." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the observation. Around them no one moved. Even Gregory had gone strangely silent. She looked toward the boy wrapped in her shawl, now sitting quietly with bread still clutched in his hands. "He looked cold," Clara answered softly. "And hungry." Damon glanced toward the boy briefly, then back to her. "And you are not?" Clara lowered her gaze automatically. Years of surviving under Gregory Whitmore had taught her one thing above all else. Never speak too boldly. Never ask for more than what was given. Never draw attention to yourself. "I am used to it," she said after a moment. Somewhere behind Damon, one of the royal guards shifted subtly, though Clara could not tell why. Gregory suddenly stepped forward with forced confidence, clearing his throat loudly. "Your Majesty," he interrupted, smiling too quickly. "Clara is humble, quiet, a hard-working Omega despite her limitations." Clara nearly flinched at the sudden warmth in his voice. Gregory had not spoken kindly to her in years. Damon did not look at him. "Limitations?" he asked. Gregory laughed nervously. "Well, she is weak, you understand. Never shifted properly. Not exactly valuable in a proper pack." Evelyn nodded eagerly beside him. "We have tried everything to help her," she added sweetly. "But some girls simply are not useful." Clara stared at the mud near her shoes. Strange how quickly kindness appeared when power arrived. Last winter, Gregory had left her outside in freezing rain because she had accidentally broken a lantern. Evelyn had laughed while Clara scrubbed floors with numb hands. But now they stood close together like caring family. Damon's expression did not change. If anything, he seemed quieter somehow. More distant. Yet she gave away the only thing she had, he said. Gregory hesitated. Well? And covered a freezing child with her own shawl, Damon continued calmly. Interesting behavior for someone you describe as worthless. The word settled heavily in the air. Worthless. Clara's chest tightened faintly. Gregory opened his mouth, then closed it again. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably beneath the king's gaze. For the first time in years, Clara watched them struggle for words. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, mostly she felt tired. So very tired. Damon turned toward Clara again. Were you sold here willingly? The question struck harder than she expected. Clara swallowed carefully. Around them, the square felt impossibly still again. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the horses stood silent beneath the rain. Clara could feel Gregory watching her now, warning her without words the way he always had. Do not embarrass the family. Do not cause trouble. But what family? The thought came quietly, unexpectedly. Families protected each other. Families did not trade daughters for coins. Her throat tightened painfully. No, she said softly. Gregory stiffened instantly. Now hold on, he interrupted quickly. Your Majesty, she does not understand our financial situation. We had no choice. Damon finally turned toward him fully. Gregory's voice faltered beneath the weight of silver eyes. No choice, Damon repeated. Tell me, Gregory Whitmore. His tone remained calm, though somehow colder now. How much was your daughter worth? Gregory hesitated. Nobody answered for him. Rain dripped steadily from the edge of the auction platform. Somewhere nearby, wind rattled loose signs hanging above vendor stalls. Finally, Gregory cleared his throat. 1 copper, he admitted quietly. Silence. Damon said nothing for several long seconds. Clara could not explain why, but something shifted in the air around him. Not anger exactly. Something quieter. More dangerous in its stillness. Then unexpectedly he looked back at Clara. Really looked at her. At the soaked dress. The thin sleeves. The way she tried unsuccessfully to hide cold hands inside damp fabric. The exhaustion beneath her eyes. How long has it been? Damon asked quietly. Since someone asked whether you were all right? Clara blinked. The question startled her more than anything else had all day. Nobody asked things like that. Not about her. Not ever. Her lips parted slightly, though no answer came immediately. Because the truth was, she could not remember. Clara could not remember the last time anyone had asked whether she was all right. The question lingered in the cold air between them, strange and unfamiliar. Like hearing a word from a language she had forgotten she once knew. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. For a brief second she saw flash. The question settled into the cold afternoon air with enough force to silence the square all over again. Clara almost wished she could take the words back. Not because she regretted asking, but because she suddenly realized what she had done. Nobody questioned King Damon Blackthorne. Nobody spoke to him as though he were simply another worried person standing in the rain. Gregory looked moments away from collapsing entirely. Clara! He hissed sharply beneath his breath, voice strained with panic. Enough! Evelyn's face had gone pale beneath careful makeup. Even the royal guards had stiffened subtly, exchanging brief glances Clara could not quite understand. But Damon did not look offended. If anything, something unreadable flickered behind his silver eyes again. Surprise perhaps. Or maybe confusion. As though nobody had asked him that question in a very long time. The rain misted quietly around them, soft now, almost fragile. Damon was silent for several seconds before answering. Yes, he said at last, voice lower than before. I think he is. Clara felt something ache softly inside her chest. She understood fear that sat quietly. The kind that made words disappear. The kind that stayed hidden because nobody stopped long enough to notice it. How old is he? She asked gently. One of the guards shifted again as though uncertain whether this conversation should even continue, but Damon answered anyway. 8. Clara nodded slowly. 8 was still young enough to feel everything too deeply, and not know how to explain any of it. Did something happen? She asked softly. Damon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Our parents died years ago, he said carefully. But recently, he paused. The pause alone said enough. He stopped sleeping well, Damon finished quietly. Stopped talking much. Yesterday, he stopped speaking altogether. Clara looked down for a moment, fingers curling faintly at her sides. She remembered being 8, sitting outside the Whitmore house after her mother got sick, listening to grown-ups whisper things they thought children could not hear. Loss changed people quietly sometimes. Not all hurt looked dramatic. Some of it simply made a person smaller over time. Does anyone sit with him? Clara asked. Damon looked at her strangely. He has servants. Clara hesitated carefully. That is not what I meant. Silence again. Heavy. Unexpected. Clara swallowed softly, suddenly aware of how bold she sounded. But the thought would not leave her alone now. Somewhere far away, in a place she would never see, there was an 8-year-old boy hurting quietly enough that even a king sounded tired when speaking about him. Sometimes, Clara said carefully, eyes lowering toward the muddy ground, people stop talking because they are afraid nobody really wants to hear what they feel. Damon said nothing, but something shifted in the air around him. Not colder, not warmer, just quieter somehow, like a tension narrowing. Nearby, the hungry boy wrapped in Clara's shawl watched silently, clutching bread against his chest as if it were something precious. Gregory suddenly forced another laugh, too loud for the moment. Your Majesty, he interrupted awkwardly, surely there are royal healers better suited for this sort of thing. Damon finally looked away from Clara. Gregory visibly relaxed for exactly 1 second. Then Damon's gaze settled on him with enough calm intensity to make the older man straighten immediately again. And yet, Damon said quietly, none of them asked whether he was scared. Gregory opened his mouth, then quickly closed it again. Evelyn stared at the king as though trying desperately to understand how the conversation had somehow gone this wrong. Clara shifted uncomfortably. She had not meant to cause trouble. She rarely meant to. Trouble simply found her whenever kindness did. Damon looked toward the royal carriage for a long moment, expression unreadable. Rain tapped softly against the polished black frame. Somewhere inside, movement stirred behind drawn curtains. One of the guards stepped closer, lowering his voice respectfully. Your Majesty, the man said quietly, Prince Rowan still has not eaten. Clara looked up instinctively. Damon closed his eyes briefly, just long enough that exhaustion slipped through whatever careful control he usually carried. It vanished quickly, but Clara had seen it. Seen the weight sitting quietly behind silver eyes. He looked tired. Not physically. Lonely perhaps. Burdened. Like someone carrying too much for too long. Without meaning to, Clara spoke again. Maybe he is lonely. The words came softly. Honest. Damon looked at her immediately. Lonely. Clara nodded slowly. People get quiet when they think nobody understands them. She hesitated. Sometimes when I felt scared as a kid. Her voice softened unexpectedly. My mother would sit near me and tell stories until I fell asleep. Even when I said I wanted to be alone. For a moment, Clara forgot where she was entirely. Forgot Gregory. The market. The crowd watching every breath she took. She only thought about a little boy somewhere who had stopped speaking. Damon's expression had gone strangely unreadable again, though not distant this time. Focused. Careful. Like he was trying to understand something fragile. Then, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear, he asked, if you met someone afraid of the world. He paused briefly. How would you help them? Clara blinked softly, startled by the question. She looked toward the boy still wrapped in her shawl and smiled faintly. I think, she said quietly, I would sit beside them first. Then she looked back at Damon. People stop feeling afraid when they stop feeling alone. I think I would sit beside them first. People stop feeling afraid when they stop feeling alone. Clara's words settled quietly between them, softer than rain against wood, yet somehow heavier than everything spoken before. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, Damon Blackthorne looked completely still. Not the stillness of power. Something else. The kind that happened when a person unexpectedly heard truth in a place they never thought to look for it. Around them the market remained frozen. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt anymore. Even Gregory Whitmore had fallen silent, though Clara could feel his frustration simmering somewhere behind her like heat from a dying fire. She should have stopped talking. She knew that. Girls like Clara did not give advice to kings. They certainly did not speak openly about fear, loneliness, or children hidden inside royal carriages. Yet something about Damon's tired expression had unsettled her. Beneath the sharp edges of authority and cold control, she had caught something painfully familiar. Someone trying very hard not to fail another person. Damon looked toward the black carriage again. Rain traced silver lines across polished windows, blurring reflections into soft shadows. Somewhere inside sat an 8-year-old boy who had stopped speaking to the world. Clara imagined him curled beneath blankets too large for him, quiet in the way hurt children became quiet. The kind of silence that adults often misunderstood. "Sit beside him," Clara said carefully, surprising herself by continuing. Damon glanced toward her again. "Even if he does not want to talk," she added softly. "Especially then." One of the royal guard shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty," the man said carefully, lowering his voice, "we should return before dark." Damon said nothing immediately. Clara suddenly wondered if she had overstepped. Heat crept into her cheeks despite the cold air. "I am sorry," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I should not have spoken so much." Damon's answer came quieter than expected. "No." Clara looked up. His silver eyes remained on her, unreadable but strangely steady. "You said more in 5 minutes than royal physicians have managed in weeks." Clara blinked softly, unsure what to do with that. Compliments usually arrived with conditions in the Whitmore house. Help more. Work harder. Be grateful. She had almost forgotten what simple honesty sounded like. Gregory suddenly cleared his throat loudly, desperation creeping into his voice now. "Your Majesty," he said quickly, forcing another smile, "perhaps this misunderstanding has gone on long enough. Clara belongs to our household. We can continue our arrangements privately." Clara stiffened faintly at the word belongs. Damon turned slowly toward Gregory. The quiet in the square deepened immediately. Nobody shifted. Nobody breathed too loudly. "Belongs," Damon repeated calmly. Gregory nodded too eagerly. "Family obligation, you understand." Damon studied him for a long moment, gaze impossible to read. Then his attention shifted toward the auction platform again. Toward the list of names nailed to damp wood. Toward the frightened Omegas waiting silently beneath leaking awnings. Toward the cages. The shivering children. The nervous merchants pretending not to watch. Something cold moved across Damon's expression then. Not anger exactly. Disappointment perhaps. Controlled and heavy. "Tell me," Damon said quietly, "how many families in Black Hollow sell their daughters?" Gregory faltered immediately. "Well, Your Majesty, difficult winters. I did not ask for excuses." His voice never rose. Somehow that made it worse. Gregory swallowed hard. Evelyn took a careful step back beneath her umbrella. Clara stood motionless, uncertain what was happening anymore. Damon stepped closer to the platform, boots sinking lightly into wet mud. The royal guard straightened immediately behind him. "This market closes today," Damon said calmly. Murmurs broke instantly through the crowd. Shock, confusion, fear. One merchant protested weakly. "But Your Majesty, these arrangements are lawful under local pact." Damon looked at him once. Just once. The man immediately fell silent. "Lawful does not mean right," Damon said quietly. Clara felt something strange tighten in her chest. Nobody had ever spoken like that in Black Hollow. Here survival always mattered more than fairness. People accepted cruelty because they believed there was no choice. Yet Damon stood in the middle of cold rain speaking as though kindness still counted for something. Gregory stepped forward again, panic beginning to edge into his voice. "Your Majesty, surely Clara can still remain with us. We only meant to teach responsibility." Clara almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Responsibility. As though hunger had been a lesson. As though loneliness had been discipline. Damon looked toward Clara then. Really looked at her again. At the soaked sleeves. The cold reddened hand she kept hiding. The exhaustion she wore like second skin. Then, quietly enough that only nearby voices could hear, he asked, If given the choice, he paused briefly, would you go back with them? The question landed harder than Clara expected, because no one had ever asked what she wanted before. Not Gregory. Not Evelyn. Not the pack. Clara looked toward the Whitmores instinctively. Gregory's expression had tightened into warning again. Evelyn looked furious beneath polished calm. For years, fear had answered every question for her. Stay quiet. Do not cause trouble. Survive. But standing here now, rain cooling against tired skin, something shifted quietly inside Clara for the first time in years. Small. Fragile. Dangerous. Hope. Her fingers curled faintly against damp fabric. And when she finally answered, her voice barely rose above the rain. No, Clara whispered. I do not think I would. The words barely left Clara's mouth before silence crashed over Black Hollow like another storm. No, I do not think I would. The honesty of it startled even her. For a second, Clara almost wondered whether someone else had spoken. Someone braver. Someone stronger. Because girls like Clara Whitmore learned very young that survival meant obedience. It meant lowering your eyes, swallowing hurt, saying yes even when every part of you wanted to say no. Yet standing in cold rain with mud soaking through her worn shoes, something inside her felt different now. Not healed. Not safe. Just tired enough to stop pretending. Gregory Whitmore stared at her as though she had betrayed him. His mouth opened slightly before closing again. Shock settled awkwardly across his face, quickly followed by anger poorly hidden beneath politeness. Clara, he said tightly, forcing a strained laugh toward Damon. She does not mean that. Emotions are high. You understand how dramatic omegas can be. Clara's stomach twisted faintly. Dramatic. The word felt familiar. Gregory had used it whenever she cried quietly after long nights scrubbing floors. When she got sick and could not finish chores fast enough. When loneliness pressed so heavily against her chest she barely recognized herself anymore. Damon did not respond immediately. He simply looked at Clara, silver eyes unreadable beneath gray skies. Something strange passed between them then. Not trust exactly. Something quieter. Recognition perhaps. Like he believed her answer mattered. Like he had actually asked because he wanted the truth. Clara was not used to that feeling. Evelyn stepped forward suddenly, smile returning too quickly. Your Majesty, she said smoothly, voice dipped in practiced sweetness. Clara has always struggled emotionally. She becomes confused under pressure. Clara blinked slowly. Confused. That was easier than admitting cruelty, she supposed. Easier than admitting someone had become convenient to forget. Damon's gaze shifted toward Evelyn at last. She straightened instinctively beneath it. Confused, he repeated quietly. Interesting. Evelyn's smile tightened. We only want what is best for her. Clara almost looked away. Best for her had once meant sleeping beside the kitchen fireplace because Evelyn needed more closet space. Best for her had meant eating after everyone else finished. Best for her had meant learning how to disappear quietly enough nobody complained she existed. Damon turned back toward Clara instead. And what do you want? He asked calmly. Clara froze. Again with impossible questions. What do you want? Nobody had asked that before either. Not really. Wants were luxuries for girls with choices. Clara's wants had become smaller over time. Enough food to stop hunger from aching. A blanket without holes. One quiet morning where nobody yelled her name before sunrise. But standing here now with rain misting softly around them and silver eyes waiting patiently for an answer, something fragile surfaced beneath years of exhaustion. Clara hesitated. Her voice caught unexpectedly. She looked toward the frightened Omega still waiting beneath leaking coverings nearby. Toward the young girl shivering behind rusted bars. Toward the little boy wrapped in her shawl. Then quietly she said, I think I just want somewhere I am not afraid all the time. Nobody spoke. Gregory looked horrified now. Evelyn's composure cracked slightly around the edges. But Damon remained still. Very still. His expression did not soften, not visibly. Yet something changed. The sharp distance in him quieted somehow. Like winter easing just enough to reveal the shape of spring beneath it. One of the guards approached carefully from the carriage again. Your Majesty, the man said respectfully, lowering his voice, Prince Rowan refuses food again. Damon closed his eyes briefly. Clara noticed the tiny movement immediately. The exhaustion there. The worry. It sat beneath all the control he carried, hidden carefully but impossible to miss once seen. Before she could stop herself, Clara asked softly, "Does he like stories?" Damon looked back at her. "Stories?" Clara nodded faintly. "When I was little, my mother used to tell me stories when things felt scary." She hesitated, fingers curling lightly into damp sleeves. "Sometimes fear gets quieter when someone stays." Damon watched her for a long second. Rain tapped softly against carriage windows behind him. Somewhere inside sat an 8-year-old boy who had not spoken in days. Alone perhaps. Quiet in ways nobody knew how to reach. Damon's jaw shifted slightly, thoughtful now. Then, to the visible shock of everyone standing nearby, he asked, "Would you come with me?" The square went completely silent. Gregory stepped forward instantly. "Absolutely not," he blurted before stopping himself. Evelyn's face drained of color. Clara forgot how to breathe entirely. Damon did not look away from her. "My brother," he said quietly, voice low enough only nearby ears could hear, "might need someone who understands loneliness." Clara's pulse stumbled painfully in her chest. Nobody had ever needed her before. Not really. Needed work from her. Expected things from her. But needed her? The thought felt terrifying. Impossible. Somewhere deep inside the carriage, faint enough she almost missed it, came the sound of a child crying quietly. The sound was quiet enough that most of Black Hollow never noticed it. A child crying softly behind heavy carriage curtains. Fragile. Exhausted. The kind of crying that came only after someone had tried very hard not to cry at all. Clara felt the sound before she fully understood it. Something inside her chest tightening instinctively. Fear recognized fear. Loneliness recognized loneliness. Damon stood impossibly still beside the carriage, though Clara noticed the slight tension settling across his shoulders now. Worry. The kind carried too long. He looked toward the dark window once before returning his attention to Clara, silver eyes unreadable beneath soft gray skies. "Would you come with me?" he repeated quietly. Around them the entire market seemed to hold its breath. Gregory Whitmore stepped forward so quickly his boots slipped slightly in wet mud. "No," he said sharply, voice rising before quickly softening again. "Your Majesty, surely this is unnecessary. Clara is not suited for royal matters." Evelyn nodded quickly beside him. "She barely speaks to people," she added, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully thin now. "Honestly, she gets overwhelmed very easily." Clara lowered her gaze automatically, old habits pulling at her. Usually this was the part where she apologized. Agreed. Made herself smaller to avoid trouble. But somewhere behind Damon, another quiet sound drifted from the carriage. Not louder. Just enough. Enough to remind her there was an 8-year-old child sitting alone and hurting somewhere inside. Her fingers curled faintly into damp fabric. Damon did not look at Gregory immediately. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Moments ago, you described her as useless." Gregory faltered. "Well, I only meant..." "And now," Damon continued calmly, "suddenly she matters very much." Gregory's face flushed. Evelyn looked away entirely. Clara stared at the mud near her shoes, unsure whether to feel embarrassed or relieved. The rain had softened into mist now, clinging gently to everything. Somewhere nearby, one of the frightened Omegas coughed quietly beneath torn coverings. The little boy wearing Clara's shawl still sat near the crate, watching everything with wide eyes as if afraid blinking might make the moment disappear. Clara glanced toward the carriage again. "He sounds sad," she whispered before thinking better of it. Damon's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "He misses our mother," he said quietly. Something in the way he said "our mother" unsettled Clara unexpectedly. Softer than before. Less king. More brother. "He used to sleep in her room during storms," Damon added after a pause. "Since winter started." His jaw tightened briefly. "Nothing seems to comfort him." Clara looked toward the darkened carriage window again. 8 years old. Too young to understand grief fully. Old enough to feel abandoned by it. She remembered storms after her own mother died. Nights spent curled beside cold fireplaces pretending thunder did not make loneliness worse. She remembered wishing someone would simply sit nearby. Even silently. Especially silently. Can I ask something? Clara said carefully. Damon nodded once. Does he have someone who stays with him? Damon hesitated. Just enough for Clara to understand the answer before he spoke. People care for him, he said. Clara lowered her eyes gently. People care for him. Not the same thing. Not really. Care sometimes looked like duty. Loneliness needed presence. Sometimes, Clara said softly, when people feel scared, too many strangers can make it worse. Damon watched her carefully. You think he is afraid? Clara nodded faintly. I think maybe he feels alone. Silence again. Heavy and thoughtful. Gregory suddenly laughed nervously. Your Majesty, with respect, Clara barely knows how to take care of herself. Clara flinched faintly. Damon finally turned toward him fully. Yet somehow, he said quietly, she noticed my brother's pain before anyone else in this square. Gregory went silent immediately. Clara's pulse stumbled painfully inside her chest. Nobody had ever defended her before. Not once. Not in ways that mattered. Damon looked back toward her then. Expression unreadable once more. You would not be forced, he said calmly. You could leave whenever you wished. Clara blinked softly. Leave whenever you wished. The word sounded unreal somehow. Choice. She barely recognized the shape of it. Evelyn stepped closer quickly. Clara, she said tightly through clenched teeth. You belong with your family. Family. The word landed strangely now. Clara looked toward Gregory. Toward Evelyn. Toward the people who had stood beneath umbrellas while she shivered in rain. The people who sold her for 1 copper without hesitation. Then she looked toward the carriage again. Another soft sound came from inside. Small. Lonely. Afraid. Something settled quietly inside Clara then. Not courage exactly. Just certainty. Simple and clear. She turned slowly back toward Damon. If, her voice caught briefly. If he really needs someone, she hesitated, fingers trembling faintly against damp sleeves. I could try. Gregory's face went pale instantly. Evelyn looked horrified. But Damon only watched her for one long moment before nodding once. Quietly. Like he had expected nothing less. Then, for the first time all afternoon, something close to relief flickered briefly across his face. Thank you, he said softly. And somehow impossibly, those 2 words hurt Clara's heart more than cruelty ever had. Thank you. The words followed Clara more heavily than the cold ever had. She stood frozen for a moment beneath soft gray skies, rain clinging to her damp hair while the entire market stared as though the world had tilted sideways. Nobody thanked Clara Whitmore. Not for kindness. Not for trying. Mostly people sighed around her, corrected her, forgot her. But Damon Blackthorne had looked directly at her and said thank you like it mattered. Like she mattered. The feeling unsettled her more than she expected. Gregory Whitmore recovered first. Absolutely not, he said sharply, stepping forward through wet mud, desperation cracking through his voice now. Your Majesty, this is ridiculous. Clara's family. We have responsibilities. Clara nearly looked behind her to see who he meant. Family. Responsibilities. Strange how words changed shape when power arrived. Damon turned slowly toward Gregory again, patience wearing thinner now. Responsibilities, he repeated quietly. Gregory nodded quickly. Of course. Damon glanced toward the auction platform where Clara's name still hung beside a crude price written in dark ink. 1 copper. The sight alone seemed to quiet something dangerous inside him. Interesting way to show devotion, Damon said calmly. Gregory followed his gaze and visibly paled. Evelyn stepped in quickly, smoothing rain from her sleeves. There has clearly been misunderstanding, she said, voice softer now. Clara has always been sensitive. Emotional. Clara lowered her eyes instinctively. Sensitive. Emotional. Difficult. Weak. Words settled into a person after enough years. Sometimes they became heavier than truth. Damon's attention returned to Clara instead. Do you have belongings you wish to take? He asked quietly. Clara blinked softly. Belongings. The question startled her. She owned very little. A worn blanket hidden beneath loose floorboards. 2 dresses, both patched more times than she could count. A book of stories her mother once read aloud before illness took warmth from their house. And an old silver hair ribbon folded carefully in a box because throwing it away felt too much like losing her mother again. Clara hesitated. "Only a few things," she said quietly. Damon nodded once. "You may collect them." Gregory stepped forward again immediately. "Your Majesty," he said tightly, forcing politeness that no longer sounded convincing. "Surely we should discuss proper arrangements. Compensation, perhaps." The square went painfully silent again. Clara felt her stomach twist faintly. Compensation. There it was. The real reason beneath all the sudden concern. Gregory did not want Clara. He wanted value. Damon looked at him for a long second. The kind of silence that made even Wind seem hesitant. Then calmly, Damon removed a pair of dark gloves and handed them to one of his guards. "Gregory Whitmore," he said quietly, "you sold your daughter publicly for 1 copper. Gregory swallowed hard. "We were desperate." Damon's expression did not change. "And yet," he said softly, "you suddenly remember her worth when someone else notices it." Gregory looked away first. Evelyn stood perfectly still now, lips pressed thin. Clara watched everything with strange distance, like her mind had not yet caught up to reality. She was leaving. The thought felt impossible. Frightening. Fragile. Leaving the house where loneliness lived in every room. Leaving the kitchen where she stood invisible while others laughed around warm dinners. Leaving behind years of trying desperately to earn love that never arrived. Damon spoke again, voice calm enough to cut deeper than anger ever could. "No payment will be offered." Gregory stiffened instantly. "But people are not debts to collect," Damon said quietly. "And Clara Whitmore owes you nothing." Something inside Clara cracked softly then. Not painfully. More like ice finally beginning to melt after too long frozen. Nobody had ever said words like that for her. Not once. Nearby, the little boy still wearing Clara's shawl smiled shyly toward her. Small. Quiet. Like he somehow understood everything changing without needing explanation. Clara smiled back faintly before turning toward Damon again. "Will your brother?" She hesitated softly. "Will he be scared if I suddenly show up?" Damon's expression shifted subtly. Less guarded somehow. "Probably," he admitted quietly. "He does not trust easily anymore." Clara nodded slowly. That she understood. Trust became difficult after enough hurt. "Then maybe," she said carefully, "I could just sit nearby first." Damon looked at her for a moment longer than expected. Rain traced quiet lines down the dark fabric of his coat. "You really believe presence matters that much?" he said softly. Clara thought of nights spent wishing someone had simply stayed. Thought of cold winters after her mother died. Empty rooms. Silence stretching too far. "I think," she said quietly, "being alone too long changes people." Something unreadable flickered behind Damon's silver eyes then. Familiarity perhaps. Like the words landed somewhere unexpectedly personal. Before either of them could say more, the carriage door opened slightly. One of the guards stepped down carefully, lowering his voice. "Your Majesty," he said gently. Prince Rowan asked if the rain stopped. Damon looked toward the carriage immediately, something softening beneath all the control he carried. Clara noticed it before he could hide it. Love, worry, quiet protectiveness. Then Damon looked back toward Clara. "Would you like to meet him?" he asked softly. Clara's pulse stumbled painfully again. Somewhere behind dark windows sat a lonely 8-year-old boy who had stopped speaking to the world. And somehow, impossibly, she was being invited closer.